Welcome back. Thom Hartmann here with you. And on the line with us is Lamar Waldron, author of numerous books, The Hidden History of the JFK Assassination, and most recently, Watergate, The Hidden History, Nixon, the Mafia, and the CIA. He and I together wrote Ultimate Sacrifice and Legacy of Secrecy back in the day. And Legacy of Secrecy is still out there, right? Still in print?
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
Okay, great. Lamar, why, let's continuing along with this. Why is Nixon, well, actually, to start out, tell us how Nixon used branding and Roger Ailes. You mentioned Roger Ailes briefly. In my book, Crash of 2016, I've got a whole chapter on how Roger Ailes in the Nixon White House pitched GOP TV to Nixon. Nixon couldn't get the money for it. Finally, Ailes found a billionaire in Rupert Murdoch who said, yeah, let's do that. They called it Fox News. Nixon used branding and Roger Ailes to make himself president. And how did Trump do the same thing?
Well, and even before we get into Trump, a lot of your listeners may have heard the name of H.R. Haldeman.
Right.
Haldeman and Ehrlichman were Nixon's two top aides in his White House. Most people don't know where H.R. Haldeman came from. If you've ever seen the Mad Men television show or know about advertising people, that's where H.R. Haldeman came from. He was a California advertising man, just one of those Mad Men types who had to come up with all these ways to get people to buy products. And one of his best successes was the toilet cleaner called Santa Flush. So basically, even before Ailes was on board, and I think Ailes came on board because Haldeman realized they needed someone like that, was they were going to package Nixon and sell him just like Santa Flush. And so they would have these things, kind of forerunners to Fox News a little bit, where even say like in Georgia, Nixon would come here, but he wouldn't have a press conference where he would take questions from real citizens unscreened. He wouldn't take questions from the general news media. They would have these phony events where they would have a carefully selected audience, some very compliant, sympathetic journalists, and Roger Ailes would produce these things, and it would basically be like a three-ring circus with Nixon as the ringmaster, and he knew he knew every question he would be asked. He had a polished answer. Nixon, oddly enough, probably would have made a pretty good game show host if the politics hadn't worked out. But it was all about creating this brand. And the writer Naomi Klein had a great way to phrase it that applies to Nixon and it applies to Trump as well. She talked about candidates who don't meet the needs of voters, but instead sell the promise of meeting their needs. That's what Nixon did back in 1968 and in 72 when he was reelected overwhelmingly, even after Watergate. And that's what Trump has been doing. Trump makes some specific promises, which he'll then break, but he still leaves his supporters with the impression that he could meet their needs, whereas these other candidates like Hillary Clinton couldn't meet their needs, and so it actually gives him a very low bar. And the same thing with Nixon. I mean, the very middle American silent majority people who voted for Nixon, it was a lot of their sons and some daughters who wound up dying basically to enrich Nixon and a lot of military contractors and the dictator of South Vietnam. So that whole branding, so Trump has been using PR to brand himself as a successful businessman since the 80s, even as his businesses kept declaring bankruptcy. But and sometimes he couldn't afford a publicist, so he would pretend to be his own publicist. And then even when he had more bankruptcies into the 2000s, even when we had the Republican crash that started in 2006, and even good businessmen could not get loans, and Trump had not been able to get major loans from U.S. banks. He had turned to Germany, to Deutsche Bank. He was then suing them. So that's where Russia comes in. Who else was going to loan Trump money circa 2008 except those Russian oligarchs? And, these aren't mortgages that you file at your local county courthouse. There are other ways those transactions are handled. And I've got to say the Europeans and some American journalists have done really good jobs of just tracing. I mean, it's just, you'll have money flow through dozens and dozens of companies and countries and Cyprus and all these things.
Sure.
But, we now have a special prosecutor.
Yeah, it should be clear, by the way, that it is not just Russian oligarchs. I mean, you've got Saudi oligarchs, you've got, UAE oligarchs, you've got oligarchs from a whole bunch, bunch of the Stan countries. They've been either laundering money or simply making high-ticket purchases of Trump properties over the years.
This brings us to a great point, too. It's like Trump loves every dictator who has given him money or who could give him money. He loves every repressive regime with one huge exception, and that's Cuba.
Right. Yeah. So why was Nixon obsessed with Cuba? How did it lead to Watergate? And why is Trump trying to continue Nixon's Cold War with Cuba today?
Well, so Cuba in the 1950s was a paradise for rich Americans. It wasn't a working class, blue collar casino town like Las Vegas. That wasn't what Havana was. A lot of the casinos had dress codes. I mean, you were in black tie, you were in a tuxedo at the very least. And so Cuba was the playground of America's wealthy. And
it was run by the mob by him.
It was run by the Mafia and the dictator of Cuba, Batista, who loved Richard Nixon just like the Mafia loved Nixon. And so Nixon actually had business interests. That's some of his first business interests were in Cuba through his friend Bebe Rebozo, who was Cuban but not a Cuban exile. Bebe Rebozo was born in Tampa, Florida. But so to Nixon, Cuba was paradise. Who cared if there was one rural hospital in the entire country? Who cared if a lot of Cuba was still in a plantation economy where the people were practically slaves? And so Nixon loved that. He hated Fidel Castro. When Castro went to Washington, Eisenhower, the president, got out of town, said, Nixon, you handle this. It's the only thing I'll let you handle. Do it. And instead of talking to Fidel Castro, saying, look, all that money that the Cuban dictator stole, that the Mafia stole, we're going to help you. We're going to help you start doing. No, none of that. He got a lecture from Nixon, and Nixon immediately started trying to kill Fidel Castro. Shortly before the 1960 election, Nixon ordered the CIA to hire the Mafia to kill Fidel before the 1960 election, where Nixon was facing JFK, because Nixon thought people would stick with the 8-year vice president instead of the young, relatively untested John F. Kennedy. The Mafia didn't do that, but get this, for hubris, Nixon publicly accepted the results of the election. Privately, he had the RNC challenge the election. Nixon thought he might yet be president, so he ordered the CIA not to tell President-elect Kennedy about these CIA Mafia plots, and even once Nixon had to leave office, those plots continued with the Bay of Pigs just a cover for the continuation of the CIA Mafia plots. There was no way 2,000 Cuban exiles would ever conquer Castro's 100,000-man army and militia. That was just a cover for continuing Nixon's CIA Mafia plots. What Watergate was all about was hiding that, because Nixon also, back in '60, the same mobsters he ordered the CIA to use to kill Fidel, Nixon got $1 million bribe for his pockets and his campaign from those very mobsters. That's what Watergate was about, trying to hide that bribe, trying to hide a new bribe.
Is this the Hoffa bribe or the milk?
Right, exactly. They were both Hoffa bribes. In 1960, Nixon got $1 million from the Mafia in return for stalling charges against Hoffa. Flash ahead to the end of 1971, President Nixon gets another $1 million bribe from those same mobsters, people like Santo Traficante of Tampa, Carlos Marcello of Louisiana.
The guys who killed Kennedy.
Exactly, and they confessed, to let Hoffa out of prison, but with conditions that would keep him from running the Teamsters, because they loved Fitzsimmons, who was a pliable, jolly, heavy-set, easygoing guy. They'd much rather deal with him than the volatile, tough Jimmy Hoffa. So Nixon had these two Mafia bribes 11 years apart. He had attempted to kill Fidel using the Mafia back in '60. By the way, he had also tried to kill Fidel Castro in December of '71 while he was getting the new Mafia bribe. And so Fidel Castro got pissed off. he had a dossier prepared of all the CIA attempts to kill him. Nixon found out there was a copy in Washington at the Chilean embassy, which had a socialist president then. That's why the Watergate burglars, they didn't first burglarize the Watergate. They first looked for that dossier at the Chilean embassy, and Nixon talked about that on a Watergate tape kept secret until 1999 when the New York Times wrote about it. But you won't hear that on any of the new TV specials.
Why not?
They only found a few pages of it there. That's why they had to then go to the Democrats, which is where they worried it would wind up. As far as why these TV specials avoid, I mean, what the TV specials avoid is just ridiculous. They avoid Nixon's Mafia ties, the fact that every one of the Watergate burglars and their supervisor Hunt was a current or former CIA employee. Two of the burglars were also working for the Mafia when they burglarized the Watergate. I mean, it's just, I mean, even you've heard the old lines of third-rate burglary, cover-up is worse than the crime.
But Watergate really was about Nixon and the mob, and that's never mentioned in the corporate media.
Exactly right. And it was a small part of a massive criminal enterprise. 70 people, according to one professor, were indicted or arrested or convicted of crimes for Watergate. But, you know, to see most of these documentaries, you would think Watergate was this little odd thing. E. Howard Hunt, the Watergate supervisor, is regarded as some sort of an oddball screw-up.
I got it. No. Lamar, when you hear the music, we got 10 seconds. We'll be right back. Stick around.
You're listening to Thom Hartmann. Visit ThomHartmann.com for audio and video archives.
We're talking with Lamar Waldron, author of Watergate, The Hidden History, Nixon, the Mafia, and the CIA.